Today in the episode, President Donald Trump gives the green light to tougher bipartisan sanctions on Russia. Senator Lindsey Graham says, the United States intercepts Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers with British support, while Russian warships nearby take no action. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban says he expects Russia's sanctions to be lifted by 2027. U.S. President Donald Trump has given the green light to a bipartisan bill imposing sanctions on Russia, Lindsey Graham posted on X. Republican senator noted that he had a very productive meeting with President Trump. Graham stated that the bill would allow President Trump to punish countries that buy cheap Russian oil, which fuels Putin's war machine.
This will be well-timed, as Ukraine is making concessions for peace, and Putin is all talk, continuing to kill the innocent. This bill will allow President Trump to punish those countries who buy cheap Russian oil fueling Putin's war machine. This bill would give President Trump tremendous leverage against countries like China, India, and Brazil to incentivize them to stop buying the cheap Russian oil that provides the financing for Putin's bloodbath against Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, U.S. Republican Senator on X.
Lindsey Graham is a co-author of a bill proposing a 500% tariff on U.S. imports from countries that purchase Russian fuel products. What is important, among the 50 Senate co-sponsors of the bill, there is an equal split between Republicans and Democrats. This highlights broad bipartisan support for the initiative. So if countries don't buy Russian oil and gas, this will weaken Putin's economy, and there will be more chances to force him to start negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. U.S. forces seized 2 tankers from Russia's Shadow Fleet used to evade oil sanctions. In the North Atlantic, U.S. military and Coast Guard units took control of the Russian-flagged tanker Marinera, previously known as Bella 1. In the Caribbean Sea, U.S. Southern Command said another sanctioned vessel, the tanker Sophia, was intercepted and is being escorted to the United States. The operation was carried out with support from the United Kingdom. British military assets assisted U.S. forces during the interception, including aerial surveillance and logistical support at sea. A striking detail is that Russian naval ships, including a submarine, were present near the tanker Marinera but did not intervene. This openly demonstrates that Russia has lost both the ability and the authority to protect its own Shadow Fleet, pointing to a weakening of Moscow's power on the world stage. Crew members of the detained tanker Bella 1, also known as Marinera, which had Russians on board, could face trial in the United States. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the interception of the Russian-flagged tanker shows that the United States will not tolerate violations of its sanctions.
And this was a Venezuelan Shadow Fleet vessel that has transported sanctioned oil. And the United States of America, under this president, is not going to tolerate that. I would also just add the vessel had a judicial seizure order and the crew, so that means the crew is now subject to prosecution for any applicable violation of federal law, and they will be brought to the United States for such prosecution if necessary.
The United Kingdom has confirmed it supported a U.S. operation to intercept the oil tanker Bella 1, also known as Marinera, as part of efforts to crack down on sanctions evasion linked to Russia and Iran. Britain's Ministry of Defence said UK armed forces provided support during the interception while the vessel was heading toward Russia. According to the statement, the operation is part of broader international efforts to stop so-called Shadow Fleet activity used to bypass sanctions. British officials say such networks help finance terrorism, fuel conflicts, and contribute to instability stretching from the Middle East to Ukraine.
This ship with a nefarious history is part of a Russian-Iranian axis of sanctions evasion, which is fueling terrorism, conflict, and misery from the Middle East to Ukraine. The Russian flagging of the vessel shows their role in this interconnected shadow activity we are seeing across the world, which threatens our national security, harms our economy, and undermines global security. From the statement of the UK Ministry of Defence.
Price of Russia's crude oil exports has fallen to its lowest level since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. U.S. sanctions against major oil companies and successful Ukrainian drone strikes on export terminals have sharply reduced the Kremlin's oil revenues. At the start of 2026, Russia's oil sector entered a deep downturn, with seaborne exports dropping and the price of its key Urals crude falling below $35 a barrel. To bypass restrictions, Russia increasingly relies on shadow fleet tactics. Near the Riau Islands, close to Singapore, dozens of tankers have been disappearing from tracking systems to conduct covert ship-to-ship oil transfers. Since November, around 40 such operations have been recorded, often disguising Russian oil as Iranian or other crude. Despite these efforts, Russia's budget revenues are rapidly shrinking, posing a growing challenge for the Kremlin, as oil and gas income provides nearly a quarter of federal budget funds used to finance the war. Russia's war against Ukraine could end during the first half of 2026. Volodymyr Zelenskyy said this during his speech at the ceremony marking the start of Cyprus's EU Council presidency. According to him, peace talks with European partners and the United States have reached a new milestone. Zelenskyy noted strengthening of Russian sanctions will speed up coming of peace.
At the same time, as Cyprus begins its presidency, peace negotiations have reached a new level of intensity. We work very actively, Ukraine, our European partners, and of course the United States and all members of our coalition of the willing, from Canada to Japan, from the EU to Australia, and it is possible. And we sincerely hope that this war could end during your presidency. And of course, only if enough pressure is put on the aggressor. And we all understand how wars like this one, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, our people, our children, come to an end. And when pressure is strong enough to exhaust the source of the war, peace comes.
The Russian army has struck Ukraine's energy sector in two regions. The attack left 800,000 homelands in Dnipropetrovsk region without power. Same situation is in Zaporizhia. Boiler houses there didn't work, but now are powered and operating normally. The Dnipropetrovsk Regional Police Department reported that power supply work is continuing, primarily for critical infrastructure. For now, electric transport in Dnipro is replaced by buses.
The Russians struck critical infrastructure. Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kryvyi Rih are without power. This is deliberate terror against the civilian population, an attempt to create a humanitarian catastrophe. Russia is demonstrating its unwillingness to end the war and its disrespect for Trump's peace plan. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the National Security and Defense Council's Center for Countering Disinformation, on Telegram.
2 people were killed and 8 others were injured in a combined missile and drone strike by the Russian army on port infrastructure in the Odessa region on the evening of January 7th. This was reported by Oleg Kuiper, head of the Regional Military Administration. According to him, the Russian attack damaged an administrative building, a cargo vehicle, and containers. Power workers are working to restore power to residents and ensure continued operation of critical infrastructure, particularly healthcare facilities. Viktor Orban threatened that sanctions against Russia will be lifted by 2027. Hungarian Prime Minister are trying to stay in power at any cost and remain at Kremlin's side. Parliamentary elections in Hungary will be held in April 2026, and Orban's rhetoric is aimed to discredit the European Union and pro-European opposition.
On the eve of the 2026 parliamentary elections, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban delivered another dose of criticism toward the European Union. On the 5th of January, he stated that the European Union, quote, will collapse on its own, but at the same time emphasized, Hungary does not plan to leave the EU.
Sok sikert kívánok Venezuelának.
Our commercial vectors is too one-sidedly oriented toward the European Union, and it will take us several more years to change this situation. Therefore, I would not advise Hungarians to follow the same path as the United Kingdom. But perhaps history will spare us this necessity, and we will not have to leave it, because it will collapse on its own.
Orban regularly makes provocative statements to dominate the information agenda. Sometimes he claimed that the EU is moving to a war economy, sometimes scared voters that Brussels allegedly uses Russia's war against Ukraine to deprive community states of sovereignty, sometimes convinced to vote for his party so as not to be drawn into the war. This rhetoric is designed to strengthen Orban's image as a defender of Hungary from external threats, analysts explain.
Orban does not want to lose power in any way, despite decades in it. By the way, I will also draw attention to when Orban rejoiced at the victory of certain opposition forces in Europe, he wrote, "Changes, wind of change." And he himself does not look at how long he personally has been in power, that he is already a very old politician whom part of Hungarian society no longer perceives.
In 2022, Orban won the elections thanks to a large-scale package of fiscal measures, including tax benefits. All this caused the highest inflation growth in the EU. Housing and rental prices in the country sharply rose, and inflation in the food segment reached 45% year-on-year. Budapest's debt servicing expenses are also the highest in the European Union, about 5% of GDP. And with such risks, investments in the country's economy are decreasing. Before the parliamentary elections, Orban is trying to play the same cards as in 2022, experts emphasize. Back in September 2025, he launched a program of subsidized mortgage loans for first-time homebuyers, approved tax cuts for families, and a pension supplement to be paid in February, shortly before the elections.
The 13th pension that we will receive in February will slightly improve my life, but I am suspicious of the 14th. It seems to me that Orban's government is paying it from a loan, and this is just pre-election propaganda.
Orban's main rival, leader of the TISA party Péter Magyar, promises a new course to restart Hungary's economy. This involves cutting expenses through fighting corruption. He pledges to normalize relations with Brussels, reduce state subsidies for selected companies, and increase spending on healthcare and education. Viktor Orban's team, in turn, is trying to discredit the opposition and is conducting a powerful propaganda campaign, part of which has become anti-European rhetoric.
Many measures are being taken, and they certainly have some impact, to some extent improving public perception. But the problem is that sentiments remain negative, and they cannot be radically changed in a few months because there is too little time and the amount of funds allocated is limited. Therefore, they will have some impact. They have already had some impact, but only minor, and public sentiment is very negative toward the government. Dissatisfaction is very significant. Daniel Rona, director of the 21 Research Center.
Orban, a longtime ally and friend of Putin, assures that by 2027, sanctions against Russia will be lifted because, according to him, the EU plans for complete refusal of Russian energy carriers are extremely harmful. And judging by the results of surveys by the analytical center 21 Research, Viktor Orban's party, Fidesz, is gradually narrowing the gap with the opposition. Péter Magyar's TISA is supported by 47% of voters who have decided on their choice, and Fidesz, 40%, reported by Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Stenhilov, UATV News.
That's all for today's News Digest. Stay informed, stay critical, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.